What if Harry Potter didn't just enter another world, but landed in Tony Stark's? 4 young wizards appear inside Stark Tower, and within moments, Tony realizes Harry is carrying something terrifying inside him. This story is packed with mystery, magic, science, and big twists, and I've divided it into 7 full chapters for this video. So stay till the end, and if you love crossover stories like this, subscribe, leave a like, and share the video.
Chapter 1. Uninvited, the rift opened at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday, which Tony Stark would later note was the most inconvenient possible time for a dimensional anomaly, second only to 3 a.m. and the 40 minutes before a press conference. He heard it before he saw it, a sound like a thunderclap folded inside a whisper, followed immediately by the shattering of exactly one prototype holographic display worth $2.3 million, and then Jarvis saying, very calmly, "Sir." There appear to be children in the living room. Tony looked up from the engine schematics he'd been arguing with for 6 hours. Repeat that. 4 children, sir, ages estimated 11 to 12. They appear to have materialized from a spatial discontinuity approximately 4.2 meters above the couch. A pause. They fell on the couch. Jarvis added, with a quality in his voice that Tony could only describe as loaded. Fortunately. Tony set down his wrench and walked into the living room. There were, in fact, 4 children on his couch. The first thing he noticed was the robes, actual robes, the kind you'd expect from a Renaissance fair or a Hogwarts-themed birthday party. The second thing was the wands, 3 of which were still clutched in small white-knuckled fists. The third thing was that 2 of them were unconscious. One was crying silently and trying very hard to hide it. And the fourth, a girl with enormous bushy hair and an expression like someone who had just survived a car crash and was already preparing a strongly worded letter about it, was sitting completely upright, looking around the room with eyes that were wide but rapidly cataloging. She was the first to speak. "Where?" she said in a voice that was British and extremely precise. "Are we?" Tony opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "New York," he said, because it was true and it was the simplest thing he could think of. "Specifically, the 53rd floor of Stark Tower. Who are you? How did you get into my building? And why are you wearing Halloween costumes in November?" "It's September," she said automatically. "It's November." She blinked. That, apparently, was new information she didn't know how to file yet. She looked down at her hands, at the wand she was still holding, and then back up at him with an expression that flickered between scientific fascination and barely suppressed panic. She chose fascination. Tony respected that deeply and immediately. "My name is Hermione Granger," she said. "That's Harry Potter." She pointed to the dark-haired boy who was beginning to stir. "That's Ron Weasley," a red-headed boy, currently unconscious and drooling slightly on Tony's $4,000 throw pillow. "And that's Neville Longbottom," a round-faced boy who was clutching something to his chest with both arms. Tony squinted. "Is he holding a plant?" "He wouldn't let go of it during the transit," Hermione said, as if this were a minor bureaucratic inconvenience. "Mr. Stark, Tony Stark?" Her eyes went enormous in a way that suggested the name meant something to her. Then she seemed to decide that was a secondary problem and shelved it. "Mr. Stark, I believe we have experienced an uncontrolled cross-dimensional translocation. I don't know which direction, whether we've moved laterally across parallel timelines or vertically between adjacent dimensional layers, because the theoretical framework is still quite contested even in our world. And to be honest, I only read the preliminary section of Professor Dumbledore's paper before Ron knocked it into the fire, so there are some gaps in my understanding, but the key point is, you're from another dimension." "In essence." "Yes." Tony stared at her. "Jarvis," he said. "Already running atmospheric and biometric analysis, sir. The spatial signature on the entry point is unlike anything in our database. Also, one of the children, the dark-haired one, appears to be generating a minor electromagnetic pulse every time he breathes. You may want to note that." "Oh, I'm noting it." Tony crouched down to look at Harry Potter, who had opened his eyes and was staring at the ceiling with the glazed expression of someone very used to waking up somewhere unexpected. He had a lightning bolt-shaped scar on his forehead, which was either a very committed fashion choice or evidence of something Tony definitely wanted to know more about. "Hey," Tony said. The kid blinked, focused on Tony's face. Then, with impressive composure for an 11-year-old who had just fallen out of a dimensional rift, said, "Sorry about your display." Tony glanced at the shattered holographic projector. "Yeah," he said, "we're going to have a long conversation about that." Ron woke up 11 minutes later by falling off the couch, which woke Neville, who sat up so fast he headbutted Ron, which produced a volume of noise that brought Pepper Potts out of the bedroom at a full-stride walk, wearing a silk robe, and an expression that suggested she had already calculated the probability of something catastrophic, and was simply here to manage it. She stopped in the doorway, looked at 4 children in robes, looked at Tony. "I didn't do this," Tony said. "I know," Pepper said. "They came through a dimensional rift." "I know," Pepper said again, because apparently 11 years of Tony Stark had calibrated her to accept that sentence as a reasonable Tuesday night development. She crossed to the kitchen, filled a glass of water and brought it to the red-headed boy, who was sitting on the floor looking at the ceiling lights with an expression that could only be described as religiously overwhelmed. "It's electric," he whispered. "Yes," Pepper said gently. "All of it. All the lights. In the whole building, yes." Ron turned to look at her with an expression so stunned and genuine that something in Tony's chest did a thing he ignored. "Wicked," Ron breathed. "Jarvis," Tony said, walking back toward the lab. "What are the child welfare laws regarding dimensional refugees in New York State?" "A beat." "That is," Jarvis said carefully, "not a statutory category that currently exists, sir." "Right." Tony pinched the bridge of his nose. "So I'm improvising. You do that best under pressure, sir." "Don't flatter me." He stopped, turned back to look at the 4 children. Hermione, who was already moving toward his bookshelf with a look of dangerous intellectual hunger. Harry, sitting quietly and watching Tony with old eyes that didn't match his age. Ron, who had discovered the television remote and was holding it like it might bite. And Neville, who had set his plant carefully on the coffee table and was looking at it with the tender focus of someone making sure it hadn't been traumatized. Tony thought about S.H.I.E.L.D., about what Fury would do if he found out 4 magical kids from another dimension had landed in Tony's apartment. He thought about what he'd do in response to that. "Jarvis," he said quietly, "lock down the entry logs for tonight. Dimensional anomaly data goes into a private partition, my eyes only." "Understood, sir." Tony walked back into the living room. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Ground rules, you sleep here tonight, nobody calls anyone, nobody leaves the building, and," he pointed at Hermione, who had already pulled a book off his shelf, "put that down." She looked at the book, looked at him, very carefully put the book back, then, with perfect composure, "Do you have more books?" Tony opened his mouth, closed it. "Jarvis," he said for the 4th time that night, "I'm going to need a much bigger couch." Chapter 2. The girl who read everything Tony Stark did not sleep that night. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason, which, instead of being a weapons schematic or a reactor equation or the recurring nightmare about a wormhole and the cold dark of space, was the sound of very quiet, very deliberate footsteps crossing the living room floor at 2:17 a.m. "Jarvis?" he murmured, not looking up from his workbench. "Miss Granger, sir. She's been awake for approximately 40 minutes. "What's she doing?" A pause that felt almost amused. "Reading the label on your coffee machine." Tony set down his stylus, the label. "Both sides." "She's now moved on to the user manual she found in the drawer." He walked to the lab doorway and looked out. The living room was dark except for the ambient glow of Manhattan coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. And in that light, cross-legged on the floor in front of the kitchen counter, was Hermione Granger. She had the espresso machine's instruction booklet open across her knees. A small torch, an actual handheld torch, wooden handle and all, lit and hovering in the air beside her head without any visible means of support. Tony stared at the floating light for 4 full seconds. "That's going to be a problem for my blood pressure," he said to no one. He walked into the kitchen, flicked on the under-cabinet lights, and watched the torch flicker out as Hermione startled badly and spun around. "I didn't touch anything," she said immediately. "You're reading my espresso machine manual at 2 in the morning. I wasn't going to use it. I just wanted to understand the heating element mechanism." She hesitated. "The steam wand operates at about 15 bar of pressure, which is, well, it's very different from how we produce steam, which is mostly just the charm vaporous and some focused intent, but the underlying thermodynamic principle is essentially—" "Hermione," she stopped. "Do you want coffee?" Tony asked, a beat. "I'm 11, she said. "Hot chocolate, then." She looked at him with an expression he was starting to recognize, the one where she was doing rapid internal calculations about whether accepting something made her vulnerable in a way she couldn't afford. He'd seen that expression on exactly one other person in his life, and that person had been himself in every photograph from age 7 to approximately last Tuesday. "Yes, please," she said quietly. He made it without talking. She watched the machine with an intensity that would have been unnerving from an adult, and was somehow both unnerving and desperately endearing from a child. When he set the mug in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it and looked at the foam on top like she was reading a small planet. "You can't sleep," Tony said, sitting across from her on the kitchen island stool. "It wasn't a question. I sleep fine normally." She said it in a tone that clearly meant I have not slept fine in quite some time. "How long is normally?" She looked out the window. The city blazed below, rivers of light, towers of it, nothing like anything Tony suspected existed in her world. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. "Since I was 9, she said finally, "when I found out I was a witch. There's a lot to read about when you find that out, and once I started, it seemed wasteful to stop." Tony drank his coffee. "You found out at 9? "My parents are dentists," she said with a faint note of apology for some reason. "Muggles, non-magical people, we had no idea until the owl arrived." A small pause. "Owls carry the post in our world. Of course they do. It's quite efficient, actually. The navigational instinct in Strixaluco is really—" She caught herself, looked into her mug. "Sorry, I do that. Talk too much. Ron says I turn everything into a lecture." Tony pointed at his own chest. "MIT graduate. Genius, billionaire, person who once explained arc reactor dynamics for 45 minutes at a dinner party nobody asked to attend. You're in good company." He paused. "Don't tell anyone I said that. It ruins the brand." Hermione Granger smiled. It was small and quick, and she pulled it back almost immediately, but Tony had spent enough time building things to recognize the moment when a component fits correctly into place. "What's an arc reactor?" she asked. "Miniaturized clean energy source. Basically a sun in a can." He tapped his chest. "I've got one in here, keeping me alive." Her eyes went to his chest, back to his face. The scientific fascination and the human concern arrived at exactly the same moment, which Tony found refreshingly honest. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Not anymore." She accepted that with a nod, the way people accept answers that clearly contain more underneath them, and tactfully move on. "Can I see your lab?" Tony would later tell Pepper, in a tone of genuine bewilderment, that he hadn't intended to spend 4 hours with an 11-year-old at his workbench. It had simply happened the way certain thermodynamic reactions simply proceed once the conditions are right. He showed her the lab. She stood in the doorway first, taking it in, and he watched her do it. The way her eyes moved, systematic and overlapping, nothing missed. Left to right, near to far, then back again, catching what the first pass skimmed. It was a professional scan. He didn't know what to do with that. Then she walked in, and she didn't touch anything, impressive restraint, but she stood very close to things and read them the way some people look at paintings. "What's this?" She had stopped in front of the half-assembled housing for a new repulsor design, propulsion unit, part of a suit. "A suit of armor," she said, looking at the Iron Man helmet mounted on the display stand nearby. "Something like that." The Muggle newspapers were talking about you before we left. There was a man in a metal suit who caught a plane." She looked at him with sudden sharp certainty. "That was you. The Daily Mail ran it 3 days straight," Tony said, "which I found more upsetting than the plane situation." She almost smiled again. She was looking at the repulsor housing with the same focused attention she'd given everything else. The energy output to achieve thrust sufficient for manned flight would require. She trailed off, working through it. "The power-to-weight ratio alone, arc reactor," Tony said, tapping his chest again. "Right," she thought about this. "In our world, the closest equivalent would be a sustained Wingardium Leviosa combined with directional impetus charms, but those require continuous wand contact and focused magical intent. You can't just store the effect." She frowned at the repulsor. "You've stored the effect." "That is," Tony said, "a surprisingly accurate summary of what took me 3 years to build." Hermione turned to look at him fully, and for the first time since she'd landed on his couch, the careful composure slipped enough to show what was underneath it. Not fear, not grief, but something bright and slightly overwhelming, like a window opened onto too much light. "Your world runs entirely on stored effects," she said. "Electricity, combustion, electromagnetic induction, you've systematized it. Every single thing that we do with intent and will and magic, you've found a way to do it with." She gestured at the room, taking in everything at once. "With understanding." "That's one way to put it," Tony said. "It's incredible," she said, and it came out entirely unguarded. Tony looked at his lab through her eyes for a moment. The holograms, the assembly arms, the reactor models and the armor frames and the 3 half-finished projects he'd been ignoring for a month, and felt something he recognized distantly as pride, though it arrived at an unusual angle. "Your wand," he said. "Can I look at it?" She hesitated for only a second before holding it out. He took it carefully. It was lighter than he expected, vine wood, faintly warm. He ran a scanner over it. Jarvis rendered the internal structure on the holographic display. They both stared at it. "Heartstring," Hermione said quietly. "Dragon heartstring inside the core." Tony looked at the energy signature Jarvis had mapped, a pattern of resonant fields he had absolutely no existing framework for, complex, and somehow alive in a way that made him deeply uneasy and deeply intrigued in equal measure. "This is going to ruin the next 6 months of my life," he said thoughtfully. "In a good way?" Hermione asked. He handed the wand back. "The best way," he said. By the time the sky outside started going gray, they had filled half a whiteboard. Tony's handwriting was sharp and angular. Hermione's was small and extremely neat and slightly too fast, because she was always slightly too fast. They had constructed a working comparison table of magical energy output versus electromagnetic equivalence, found 3 points of theoretical overlap, and argued productively for 40 minutes about whether intent was a measurable variable or a philosophical shortcut. Hermione's position was that intent was a real physical force that interacted with magical fields in ways that hadn't been properly quantified yet. Tony's position was that anything that couldn't be quantified wasn't science yet, just story. "Then it'll be science once we quantify it," Hermione said with perfect simple logic. Tony stared at the whiteboard. "You're going to be insufferable," he said, "when you're older." "I'm already insufferable," she said cheerfully, in a tone that suggested this was something she'd made her peace with. Tony laughed. Actually laughed, not the performance version, and was surprised enough by it that he looked away. Ron woke at 7 a.m., walked into the kitchen in his robes with his hair in 4 different directions, opened the refrigerator, and made a sound Tony could only describe as a spiritual experience. "There's food," Ron said. "Cold food, in a cold box." "That's a refrigerator," Tony said. "There's loads of it," Ron breathed. "Theirs is that chicken leftover from last night. Don't eat it, I'll make actual breakfast." Ron had already eaten the chicken cold, standing in front of the open refrigerator with the unashamed focus of someone who had grown up with 6 siblings. "He's always like this," Harry said, appearing in the kitchen doorway looking slightly more rested but still wearing the air of careful watchfulness Tony had noticed last night. "The food thing. Sorry." "Don't apologize for someone else's eating," Tony said. Harry blinked. Like that was a rule he hadn't known existed. Tony filed that away in the folder in his head labeled questions to ask later, carefully. Neville appeared last, carrying his plant. He stopped when he saw Tony, turned slightly pink and looked at the floor. "Mr. Stark," he said carefully, "I'm really sorry about landing on your sofa, and the thing that broke." "The $2.3 million prototype holographic projector," Jarvis supplied helpfully from the ceiling. Neville's face went white. "Jarvis," Tony said. "Sir?" "What's the cost of replacing that unit if I put the order in today versus if I'd ordered one last week?" A pause. "If ordered today, the new model includes an upgraded resolution array. Net improvement in value approximately $800,000. Tony looked at Neville. "You actually did me a favor." The old one was outdated. Neville stared at him. "Really? Don't thank me, it's just accounting." Tony turned to the stove. "Who wants eggs?" It wasn't a question, he was already cracking them. He made enough eggs for 8 people, mostly by instinct, and all 4 children ate at his kitchen island in various states of awe. At the induction cooktop, Hermione. At the orange juice, Ron, who seemed close to emotional about it. At the view of Manhattan, Neville, quietly. And at Tony himself. Harry, who did it sideways and thought he was being subtle and wasn't. Tony ate standing up like always. He looked at the 4 of them, he thought. "Shield cannot find out about this," he thought. "I need to call Pepper." He thought, "That plant needs more light." Neville keeps tilting it toward the window. He reached over and angled one of the automated blinds so a shaft of morning sun fell exactly where the plant was sitting. Neville looked up at him, said nothing. But something in his expression shifted, small and careful and real. Tony looked away. "Jarvis," he said, picking up his coffee. "Draft a message to Pepper. Tell her I need a lawyer, guardianship specialist, today." "Shall I specify the reason, sir?" Tony looked at 4 children eating eggs in his kitchen at 7 a.m. "Tell her it's complicated," he said. "Tell her it's very, very complicated." Chapter 3. The scan was Harry's idea, which Tony would later find both impressive and inconvenient, because it meant he couldn't pretend he'd pushed for it. It happened after breakfast, when Tony was walking Harry through the basics of the Stark pad. Not the full interface, just enough that the kid could navigate without accidentally ordering 17 drones or launching something. And Harry had tilted his head at the biometric scanner on the lab door and said, very quietly, "Can that read magical energy, or just normal biological stuff?" Tony had looked at him. Harry was looking at the scanner with an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and wasn't quite making it. "Why?" Tony asked. A pause. Harry reached up and touched the scar on his forehead, not dramatically, just the way you'd touch a bruise you'd had so long you'd stopped noticing except when something reminded you. "There's something wrong with it," Harry said. "I've always known." "Nobody says so, but I can feel it sometimes, like something's in there that shouldn't be." He dropped his hand. "I just wondered." Tony looked at the scar. He thought about the electromagnetic pulse Jarvis had flagged last night, minor, rhythmic, correlating precisely with Harry's breathing. He'd run it 3 times to make sure it wasn't instrument error. "Come into the lab," he said. He set up the deep field scanner, the medical-grade one he'd built after the shrapnel incident. The one that could read tissue density, electrical activity, and, thanks to last night's frantic theoretical framework with Hermione, a newly calibrated magical resonance detector that he was about 70% confident would work. 30% was uncharted territory. But Tony Stark had launched himself through a wormhole on worse odds. Hermione stood in the corner watching with her arms folded and her jaw tight. She'd insisted on being present, and Tony hadn't argued, partly because she'd technically helped calibrate the detector and partly because Harry had looked at her when Tony suggested it might be better one-on-one. And some wordless conversation had passed between them that Tony didn't have the context to read. She was here. That was that. Ron and Neville were in the living room. Tony had set Jarvis to play something. He'd suggested a film. Neville had quietly asked if there were any nature documentaries. And now David Attenborough's voice was drifting softly down the corridor, which was either soothing or surreal, depending on how you felt about British accents narrating penguin migrations at 9 a.m. Harry sat on the scanner bed without fidgeting. That stillness again, the practiced kind, not the peaceful kind. "It won't hurt," Tony said, adjusting the array overhead. "I know," Harry said, in a tone that meant pain isn't the thing I'm worried about. "What are you worried about?" Harry looked at the ceiling. "That you won't find anything, or that you will?" Tony had no good answer for that, so he didn't offer one. Instead he said, "Jarvis, initiate deep field. Full biological suite plus the resonance array. Log everything, private partition." "Initiating, sir." The scanner hummed. Blue light moved across Harry in careful passes, the way sonar maps a seabed. Tony watched the readouts. For the first 30 seconds, everything was normal, or normal enough, accounting for the fact that Harry was measurably, undeniably magic, which meant his baseline biological readings came with a faint resonant signature that Jarvis was now cataloging as a new reference standard. Healthy tissue, healthy brain activity, elevated cortisol for his age, which Tony clocked and filed under questions for later, slightly low iron. Growing kid, probably not eating enough. Tony was going to fix that, but that was a separate issue. Then the scanner reached the scar. Jarvis said very quietly, "Sir." Tony was already looking. The scar wasn't a scar, not just a scar. The tissue at the surface was consistent with a severe burn injury, poorly healed, years old. But underneath it, nested in the precise center of the wound like something had been placed there. "Jarvis," Tony said carefully. "What am I looking at?" "I'm not certain," Jarvis said, and Tony had built Jarvis to be honest rather than reassuring, which he appreciated right now and hated at the same time. "The energy signature is unlike anything in the magical resonance baseline we established last night. It's layered, as if the resonant field has been folded onto itself multiple times, and there's a secondary biological signature embedded within it." Tony looked up from the display, looked at Harry. "A second biological signature," he repeated. "Yes, sir, genetically distinct from Harry's own tissue. The profile is fragmented, degraded, as if whatever this is has been here for a very long time and isn't quite coherent anymore." A pause. "But it's there, faint, but there." Harry was watching Tony's face. "What does that mean?" Harry asked. Tony looked at the readout. At the folded, layered, wrong energy signature sitting inside an 11-year-old's forehead like something that had punched its way in from the outside and never left. He knew what he was looking at. He didn't know the magical terminology for it. He didn't have the framework yet. But Tony Stark had a gift, maybe his most fundamental one, beneath all the engineering and the showmanship, for looking at a system and understanding what it was doing even before he understood what it was called. This was a container. Something had used Harry's scar to store itself. "Hermione?" Tony said, without taking his eyes off the display. Her voice was very controlled. "Yes. In your world, is there a mechanism magical for preserving a piece of a person's soul, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, by anchoring it inside a living host?" The silence was long enough that Tony turned to look at her. Hermione's face had gone the color of old paper. Her arms had dropped from where they'd been folded. She was staring at the readout screen, and something in her expression told Tony she knew exactly what she was looking at, and that knowing it was making her feel sick. "Hermione," he said, quieter. "There's a dark object," she said, very carefully, very precisely, "called a Horcrux. It's created by splitting one's soul through an act of murder, and embedding the fragment into an object or a living being to ensure a form of immortality. It's the darkest magic known. The books barely cover it because the process is considered so abhorrent that the information was almost entirely removed from." She stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at Harry. Harry had gone very still, not the practiced stillness. This was something else. This was a person receiving information that rearranged everything underneath them and choosing actively to stay upright. He put a piece of himself in me, Harry said. Not a question. When the curse rebounded, Hermione said. Her voice was steady and Tony understood what it cost her. No one ever thought it would have been an accident. Voldemort would never have intended it. He put a piece of himself in me, Harry said again. The room was quiet except for the scanner's soft hum and, distantly, David Attenborough explaining that emperor penguins had evolved an extraordinary communal warmth strategy. Tony looked at the readout, looked at Harry. Thought 17 things in approximately 4 seconds, the way he always thought when a problem became real, not abstract, real, weight and consequence, and this matters. And then he said the only thing that was true and useful. It's fragmented and degraded. It's weak. And I can see it. Harry looked at him. Most things that can be seen, Tony said, can be extracted. It'll take time. I'll need to understand the mechanism before I touch it, but I've removed things from myself that had no business being there and I'm still standing. He tapped his chest where the arc reactor sat. That's a promise, not a pitch. Okay. Harry held his gaze for a long moment, searching for something, finding it apparently because something in his shoulders came down, barely perceptible, but there. Okay, Harry said. Tony nodded, turned back to the display. Jarvis, he said very calmly, flag everything from this scan. And pull me everything we know, everything from last night's magical framework build, everything from Hermione's verbal descriptions so far, all of it. I'm starting a new project file. What shall I call it, sir? Tony looked at the scar. At the folded, wrongful, occupied thing sitting inside a child's head. Call it, he said, the eviction. Hermione cried in the bathroom for 6 minutes. Tony knew because Jarvis told him, quietly, while Tony stared at the project file taking shape on the holographic display. Tony said nothing. He moved to the kitchen, made tea. He didn't drink tea, but he'd watched Pepper make it often enough that the mechanics were familiar, and left it outside the bathroom door without knocking. When Hermione came out, red-eyed and ferociously composed, the mug was in her hands in under 10 seconds. She said, "Thank you," he said. "The magical resonance data from your wand last night, I need you to help me understand how a Horcrux interacts with the host's own field. You've read more about it than anyone in this building." She looked at him, understood what he was doing, giving her something to do, turning grief into motion. He watched her decide to accept it. "I'll tell you everything I remember," she said. "But we need a book. The information was suppressed, but there's a restricted section at Hogwarts that—" "We're not in a position to visit Hogwarts." "No, but," she hesitated, "Professor Dumbledore will come looking for us. He always knows. When he does, we could ask." "You trust him?" A complicated pause, the kind that meant mostly, and mostly isn't the same as completely. "He's the most powerful wizard alive," Hermione said carefully. "And he genuinely cares about Harry. I think he cares about Harry more than he's always entirely honest about." She turned the mug in her hands. "But he'll want to take us back. And you don't want to go back." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Ron could be heard laughing at something on the television, a big, uncomplicated sound, nothing held back. Neville said something soft in response. "I want to be somewhere that Harry is safe," Hermione said, "and I want to understand things. Both of those seem possible here." Tony looked at his half-built project file. "They are," he said. Harry, to Tony's complete lack of surprise, did not cry. He sat in the lab for another hour after Hermione left, asking questions, careful, systematic questions, the kind that wanted to understand rather than just be reassured. How degraded was the signature? What the extraction mechanism might look like in theory? Whether it was affecting his nervous system, his brain activity, anything measurable. Tony answered honestly, including the parts where the answer was "I don't know yet." Harry seemed to find the "I don't know yet" preferable to false certainty. Another data point for that file Tony was building. At the end of the hour, Harry said, "Does Ron need to know about what it is?" "That's your call," Tony said. "It's your information." Harry thought about this. "Not yet," he said finally. "He worries." and there's nothing he can do right now, so the worrying would just—" He paused. "I'll tell him when there's something to tell. That's a reasonable approach." "Is it?" Harry asked, like he genuinely wasn't sure. "Protecting people from information they can't use yet isn't the same as lying," Tony said. "There's a version of honesty that's just cruelty with good intentions. What you're describing isn't that." Harry looked at him. "Did someone tell you that, or did you work it out?" "Painful experience," Tony said. "Mostly painful experience." Harry nodded slowly. Then, "Did the scan show anything else? About the pulse thing Jarvis mentioned?" "Yeah." Tony pulled up that data. "The EM pulse you generate when you're breathing, it's consistent and low-level when you're calm. It spikes when you're emotionally activated. It knocked out my prototype display when you landed, which tells me the transit itself was pretty high stress." "That's an understatement," Harry said, with the flattest possible delivery. "The pulse seems to be your magic looking for an output path. Like your body generates it but needs a focus point to discharge cleanly." Tony gestured at the wand Harry had set on the desk beside him. "That's what the wand is for. Without it, the energy has nowhere to go, so it radiates." Harry picked up the wand, looked at it. "So I'm basically a very small arc reactor that needs a focusing array, yes?" Harry stared at him. Tony shrugged. "You asked." For the first time since landing on the couch, Harry Potter laughed, short, surprised, real. It rearranged his whole face. He looked, for about 2 seconds, exactly like what he was, an 11-year-old who had just heard something absurd. Tony looked at the project file labeled the eviction. He thought, "I'm going to fix this," he thought. "I don't know how yet," he thought. "I don't know how yet has never stopped me before." That evening, Pepper arrived with a lawyer, 2 overnight bags, and the expression of a woman who had been briefed on the situation by Jarvis during the car ride and had spent 45 minutes deciding how she felt about it. She walked in, took in the 4 children, Hermione reading at the kitchen counter, Ron and Neville playing what appeared to be some card game involving cards that moved on their own, which was making Jarvis monitor them with quiet scientific fascination. She looked at Harry, who was helping Tony sort resonance data in the lab with the focused seriousness of a research assistant. She looked at Tony. "You're keeping them," she said. "Temporarily," Tony said. "Tony, until we sort out the dimensional situation." "Tony." He pulled up a holographic of the Horcrux readout. Watched her face as she understood what she was looking at, because Pepper Potts was one of the sharpest people Tony knew, and she always understood faster than he expected. Her expression went very still. "All right," she said quietly. "All right?" "All right," she set her bag down. "I'll talk to the lawyer. Temporary emergency guardianship first. We'll figure out the rest." She looked at Harry again, through the lab window. Harry was pointing at something on the display and asking Tony a question. Tony was answering it like the question deserved a full answer. "We'll figure out the rest," she said again, softer. Tony looked at the 4 kids in his apartment. He thought. Temporary, he thought. I have never been good at temporary. He thought. I should probably be more worried about that than I am. Chapter 4. The Fury problem Nick Fury found out on a Thursday. Tony had predicted Monday at the earliest, which meant he'd had 3 days longer than expected, which meant either his security was better than he thought or Fury had known since Tuesday, and was simply waiting for the optimal moment to be dramatic about it. Given that it was Nick Fury, Tony suspected the latter. The call came at 6 a.m., which was either early morning or late night depending on which direction Tony had come at it from. And the answer in this case was late night, because he'd been in the lab since 11 p.m. working on the resonance extraction models and had not technically slept. Jarvis put the call through without asking, because Jarvis had a sense of the inevitable. Fury's face appeared on the holographic display, eye patch and all, wearing an expression that Tony privately categorized as controlled detonation, the look that meant he was angry in a planned, purposeful way rather than a reactive one. "Stark," Fury said. "Fury," Tony said. "You're up early." "I've been up since 2 a.m. when one of my analysts flagged an unusual biometric signature coming out of Stark Tower." A pause. 4 unusual biometric signatures. HM. Tony didn't look up from the resonance model. Sensor glitch, probably. I've been running some experimental, Tony. Fury almost never used his first name. Tony looked up. I have satellite imaging of 4 children in medieval costumes appearing out of a spatial anomaly above your building 3 days ago. I have the EM spike data. And I have the fact that you immediately locked down your entry logs, which is the single most suspicious thing a person can do when they have nothing to hide. He leaned forward slightly. I'm going to need you to tell me what is in your apartment. Children, Tony said. From where? Another dimension, apparently. The silence that followed was approximately 4 seconds long, which for Nick Fury was the equivalent of a lesser person's dramatic collapse. Come again, Fury said. Dimensional rift. Spontaneous, as far as I can tell. I'm still working out the mechanism. 4 kids, 11 years old, from what appears to be a parallel Earth where magic is real and functional and the primary technological paradigm. Tony pulled up a secondary display and sent Fury the non-classified version of the resonance data. I've been studying the energy signatures. It's genuinely fascinating. Hermione has been helping. She's the one with the, you're on a first-name basis with the dimensional refugees. They're staying in my apartment. It would be strange not to be. Another silence. Fury looked at the data Tony had sent. His expression shifted, just slightly, just enough for Tony to clock it, into something that was less controlled detonation, and more this is extremely complicated and I need a moment. Stark, he said finally, you understand that SHIELD has protocols for? If you finish that sentence with anything involving containment, quarantine, or the phrase in the interest of national security, Tony said pleasantly, I'm going to stop being cooperative, and you know what I'm like when I'm not cooperative. I know exactly what you're like, Fury said, in a tone suggesting this was not a point in Tony's favor. Then we understand each other. Tony set down his stylus. They're children, Nick, 11 years old. They didn't choose to come here. There's no threat profile. I've run every scan I have, and the only anomalous reading is... He stopped. He'd almost said the Horcrux. He hadn't told Fury about the Horcrux. He wasn't going to tell Fury about the Horcrux, because Fury's response to learning that one of the children was hosting a fragment of a dark wizard's soul would be approximately the opposite of helpful. The only anomalous reading is, Fury prompted, is that their magical output is measurable with modified instrumentation, which is scientifically significant and not a danger to anyone. Tony met Fury's gaze on the display. I've applied for emergency guardianship. My lawyer filed yesterday. The children are safe, supervised, and not going anywhere except possibly a school enrollment, which I'm working on. You're enrolling them in school. Hermione's been awake for 72 hours finding things to read. She needs structured intellectual stimulation before she dismantles my lab out of boredom. Fury stared at him. Tony stared back. I want access, Fury said. Not containment, not interrogation. Access, one visit supervised by you, meet and greet only. I'll think about it. Tony. I said I'll think about it. He picked up his coffee. Is there anything else? Because I have a Horcrux, I have a project to get back to, and Ron's going to wake up in 2 hours and eat everything in my refrigerator again if I don't restock it before then. Fury looked at him for a long moment. You named them, he said, not an accusation, something closer to an observation. I told you their names, Tony said. They named themselves. That's not what I meant. Tony didn't answer that. After Fury ended the call, Tony sat for a moment in the quiet of the lab, the resonance model rotating slowly in the air in front of him, and thought about the fact that he had just refused the director of SHIELD on behalf of 4 children he'd known for 72 hours. He thought, this is already not temporary. He thought, yeah, I know. The lawyer's name was Catherine Mulroney, and she was the best guardianship specialist in New York, which Tony knew because Pepper had researched it thoroughly, and Pepper's research was never wrong. She arrived at 9 a.m. on Friday in a gray suit with a briefcase and an expression of absolute professional neutrality that Tony suspected she had developed specifically for dealing with clients like him. She sat at his kitchen table. She opened her briefcase. She looked at the 4 children eating breakfast across the room. Ron having a deeply sincere relationship with a stack of pancakes. Hermione reading something on a Stark pad with one hand and eating with the other. Neville quietly feeding small pieces of his toast to the succulent he'd propagated from his plant, using what appeared to be a small charm. And Harry sitting slightly apart from the others, watching the room the way he always watched rooms, and her professional neutrality flickered, briefly, into something human, then it went back to neutral. She was good, Mr. Stark, she said. Let's discuss the situation. The situation, Tony said, sitting across from her, is that 4 British children ended up in my apartment through circumstances that are, legally speaking, unprecedented, and I need a framework to keep them here and keep other parties from removing them pending a resolution. Other parties, Mulroney said carefully. Such as? S.H.I.E.L.D. has expressed interest. There may also be representatives from their point of origin who will eventually want them back. Tony poured himself coffee. I want to make sure that, when either of those parties makes a move, I have something legally solid to point at. Mulroney looked at her documents. Emergency guardianship in New York requires demonstrating that the children are without adequate parental care or supervision, that they're currently in a safe environment, and that the proposed guardian can meet their needs. She looked up. The parental care question is the immediate complication. The children's parents, their birth parents, are they living? A beat. Harry's parents are deceased, Tony said. He was living with relatives, legal guardians in their world, not parents. Something in his tone had shifted slightly. He hadn't intended it to. Ron and Hermione have living parents who are, as far as I can tell, currently unreachable given the dimensional situation. Neville's parents are. He stopped. He'd learned this yesterday, quietly, from Neville himself, who had mentioned it with the careful casualness of someone who had explained it many times and had learned to hold it at arm's length. Neville's parents are alive but incapacitated. He lives with his grandmother. Mulroney wrote something down, and the children themselves, she said. Have they expressed a preference regarding remaining in your care? Tony glanced toward the kitchen, Hermione, without looking up from the Stark pad. Yes. Ron, mouthful of pancake, definitely yes. Neville, quietly. Yes, please. Harry said nothing, but when Tony looked at him directly, he nodded once. Mulroney followed this exchange with the expression of someone recalibrating their priors. All right, she said. Emergency guardianship is achievable. I'll need to file a petition with the family court today. Given the unusual circumstances, I'd recommend a statement from a licensed mental health professional confirming the children's well-being. I can have Bruce Banner write something, Tony said. He has a doctorate in a licensed mental health professional, Mr. Stark. He has 7 PhD tickets. In relevant fields, Tony paused. I'll find someone. Mulroney made another note. There will also be a hearing. A judge will need to sign off on this, and there will likely be pushback given the unique nature of the situation. She looked at him steadily. I need to know, Mr. Stark, that you're committed to this. Emergency guardianship is not. I'm committed, Tony said. Mulroney looked at him. That was fast, she observed. I don't overthink things that are obvious, Tony said. Across the kitchen, Ron had stopped eating and was watching Tony with an expression that Tony absolutely was not going to think about, because it was the expression of someone who wasn't used to adults being committed to things where they were concerned. And acknowledging that would require Tony to feel several feelings he hadn't scheduled, he looked at Mulroney instead. File the petition, he said. Today. The hearing was set for the following Wednesday, which gave Tony 5 days. He spent them the way he spent every high-stakes interval, working the problem. The problem, in this case, was threefold. The legal problem, Mulroney was handling. The scientific problem, Tony was handling, with Hermione as an increasingly essential collaborator. And the children are currently living in a functioning weapons lab with no appropriate infrastructure problem, which Tony addressed on Saturday by spending approximately 14 hours making Stark Tower actually habitable for people under the age of 30. Jarvis helped design 4 separate rooms on the residential floor, each configured to what Tony had worked out were the relevant preferences. He didn't consult the children. He did it by observation, which was the methodology he'd always trusted more than asking. Hermione's room had bookshelves, floor to ceiling, half empty, waiting, and a desk positioned to catch the morning light and a reading lamp on a variable spectrum, so she could shift the color temperature depending on what she was working on. He put a periodic table on the wall, and then, at the last minute, a blank whiteboard, because she was going to need somewhere to put things. Ron's room he made warm. Practical reason. The Weasley home, from what Ron had described, was a cramped and cluttered and deeply lived-in place, and the clean angles of Stark Tower were clearly making Ron feel the absence of that in a way he didn't have words for. Tony added some wood-paneled surfaces, lowered the lighting a few degrees warmer, and, quietly, without explaining why, put a chess set on the dresser, because Jarvis had flagged during the card game that Ron's spatial reasoning when he played was extraordinary. And Tony had a feeling Ron didn't know that about himself yet. Neville's room got the window boxes. Tony had the automated systems install them overnight. 6 of them, running the full length of the south-facing window, filled with good soil and nothing else, because what Neville chose to put in them was Neville's business. He added a full-spectrum grow light on a timer and a small reference library of botanical texts stacked on the nightstand. He spent the longest on Harry's room. He went through 4 different configurations and rejected all of them, and somewhere around 2 a.m. he understood why every version he designed was the room he would have wanted when he was 11, which was not necessarily the room Harry needed. He stopped, sat down, thought about what he actually knew. Harry had spent 11 years sleeping in a cupboard under a set of stairs. Tony stared at the design interface for a long time. He cleared everything and started over with a single principle: space. Maximum space. No clutter, no weight. A bed that was large enough to feel genuinely safe and not like a courtesy. A window with a full view of the city, not the desk and bookshelves view, the alive at night, all of Manhattan humming below you view. Nothing on the walls except what Harry decided to put there. A door that locked from the inside and only from the inside, because Tony had noticed that Harry checked the door every time he entered a room, noted where it was, how it opened, how close he was to it. He put a bolt on it. Interior only. He did not explain this to anyone. He showed the kids the rooms on Sunday morning. He did it without preamble, just walked them down the corridor and opened the doors. Hermione made a sound that was almost entirely suppressed and went very still in the doorway of her room in a way that suggested she was doing the suppression on purpose. And then she walked in and ran her hand along the empty bookshelf, like she was reading something written there. Ron walked into his room, turned around once, saw the chess set, and looked at Tony with an expression so open and surprised and genuinely touched that Tony had to study the ceiling for a moment. Neville stopped in front of his window boxes and didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then, "They're empty." "They're yours," Tony said. "Fill them with whatever you want." Neville touched the soil with 2 careful fingers. "Mr. Stark," he said quietly. "Tony," Tony said, a pause. "Tony," Neville nodded at the boxes. "Thank you." Tony nodded. He moved to Harry's door, opened it. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the space of it, the window, the large bed, the bare walls. And Tony watched him process it the way he'd watched Harry process everything, carefully and quietly, and with more going on underneath than showed at the surface. Then Harry's eyes found the bolt on the door. He looked at it for a long moment. He looked at Tony. Tony met his gaze and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and Harry seemed to understand that and nodded very slightly, not a thank you nod, something smaller and more private than that, and walked into the room. Tony closed the door behind him. He stood in the corridor for a moment. Jarvis said gently, "Sir." "I know," Tony said. "The legal hearing is in 3 days." "I know. Director Fury has requested a meeting. Tell him Wednesday afternoon after the hearing." Tony started walking back toward the lab. "And Jarvis?" "Sir." "Order books. Hermione-level books. Fill those shelves." He paused. "And get Ron a proper chess set. The one in there is fine, but get him a tournament set, the good kind." "Of course, sir," a beat. "All 4 rooms, sir, was that?" "Yeah," Tony said. "That was right." The hearing was on Wednesday at 10 a.m., Family Court, Lower Manhattan. Tony wore a suit. Pepper wore a suit. Mulroney had a briefcase full of documents and the demeanor of someone who had won harder battles than this one. The 4 kids wore the closest things to normal clothes that Tony had been able to source in 5 days, which meant Hermione looked entirely herself. Ron looked faintly suspicious of his jeans. Neville kept straightening his collar. And Harry sat in the courtroom with the stillness of someone who had been in rooms where adults decided things about him before and had learned not to expect the decision to go his way. Tony sat next to him. The proceedings took 2 hours. There were objections. A court-appointed representative raising questions about Tony's lifestyle, his professional risk profile, the suitability of a weapons manufacturer as a guardian of children. Tony had anticipated everyone and had Mulroney answer everyone. And when the representative made the point about professional risk profile, Tony leaned over to Mulroney and said quietly, "Tell him to look up the statistics on domestic environments versus..." And Mulroney gave him a look that meant, "I already have it, be quiet," which Tony appreciated. At the end of 2 hours, the judge, a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses and an expression that had seen everything, looked at the documents, looked at Tony, looked at the 4 children sitting in a row in the gallery. She looked at Harry. Harry looked back at her with those old eyes. She signed the order, emergency guardianship, pending full review in 60 days. Tony Stark, legal temporary guardian of 4 minors. Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, Ronald Weasley, and Neville Longbottom. Outside the courthouse on the steps, Ron looked at the legal document Mulroney had handed Tony and said, "So he's in charge of us, legally." "Temporarily," Tony said. "Right." Ron looked at him. "Does that mean you have to do what we say?" "Absolutely not," Tony said. "That's the opposite of how guardianship works." "Worth a try," Ron said cheerfully. Neville was looking at the document. "It has our names on it," he said softly. "That's generally what a legal document does," Tony said. "No, I mean," Neville looked up, "it has our names on it." Like we matter enough to write down." Tony looked at the document. He thought of a lot of things. He said, "You do." Neville nodded, looking back at the paper. Hermione took a sharp breath beside him that she converted very quickly into clearing her throat. Ron looked away at the street. Harry stood slightly apart, looking out at Manhattan, the traffic, the noise, the incomprehensible scale of it. Tony moved to stand beside him. "Okay," Tony asked. Harry considered this with genuine seriousness. "I think so," he said. "I've never had I mean, the Dursleys were technically..." He stopped. "This is different." "Yeah," Tony said. "It is." They stood there for a moment, the city moving around them, unhurried and enormous. "Jarvis is going to monitor all my EM output, isn't he?" Harry said. "Already is." "And you're going to keep working on the..." He didn't say it. They'd agreed not to say it in public, the project. "Every day," Harry nodded. Then, quietly, "Tony." "Yeah, thank you for the room, the bolt." A pause. "For this." Tony Stark had exactly one method for receiving genuine gratitude without deflecting it into a joke, and it had taken him approximately 40 years to develop. And it was this. He accepted it without comment and stored it somewhere careful. "Come on," he said. "Jarvis flagged a dimensional resonance fluctuation this morning. I want to show you something." Harry fell into step beside him. Behind them, Ron had found a hot dog cart and was having a deeply personal experience. Hermione was already on her Stark pad, researching New York school curricula. Neville was looking at a crack in the courthouse steps where a weed had pushed through, with the expression of someone recognizing a friend. Tony did not look back at them. He didn't need to. He knew where they were. Chapter 5. Wingardium Leviosa and other security vulnerabilities. Nick Fury arrived at Stark Tower on Wednesday afternoon with exactly 2 people. Agent Maria Hill, who had the look of someone professionally prepared for anything, and Agent Phil Coulson. who had the look of someone personally excited about everything but expressing it through the medium of complete stillness. Tony met them in the lobby. "Ground rules," Tony said before Fury could speak. "You're guests. You don't touch anything. You don't scan anything without my permission. You don't ask the kids anything that isn't basic conversation, and if any of them wants you to leave, you leave. Immediately, no discussion." Fury looked at him. "You done?" Fury asked. "I have a second page, but I'll hold it." Hill was already looking around the lobby with the systematic attention of someone cataloging exits and access points. Coulson was looking at nothing specific in a way that meant he was doing the same thing more subtly. Tony had hired enough people who'd come out of military and intelligence backgrounds to recognize the baseline behavior. "They're fine," Tony said to Hill. "There's nowhere to go, it's a tower." "I'm just looking," Hill said. "You're assessing." "I'm just looking," she repeated pleasantly. They went up. Tony had told the kids at breakfast. He'd kept it simple. SHIELD was a government intelligence agency. They worked with the Avengers. They'd found out about the dimensional arrival and wanted a meeting. It was mandatory from Tony's perspective to keep things diplomatic, but the kids were in charge of what they said and didn't say. "What's an Avenger?" Ron asked. "A team, I'm on it. We deal with threats too large for conventional military response." "Like Voldemort?" Neville asked. "I don't know Voldemort's threat classification yet, but provisionally, yes." "What are the others like?" Hermione asked. "The other Avengers?" "Complicated people with significant power and unresolved personal issues. So similar to you, but older and with worse communication skills." Harry had asked the only operationally relevant question. "Do we have to tell them anything?" "No," Tony said. "You don't." Harry had nodded. That was enough. When the elevator opened on the residential floor, the first thing Nick Fury encountered was Ron Weasley coming around the corner at a full run with what appeared to be a self-propelled paper airplane zooming 6 inches above his head. Fury stopped. The paper airplane performed a tight barrel roll and sailed back toward the living room. "Sorry," Ron said, not slowing down. "Hermione's been teaching me origami and I accidentally." He disappeared around the corner. Fury turned to Tony. Tony spread his hands. "Magic. You said that word already. I've been trying to decide how I feel about it. And still deciding." Fury watched the space where Ron had been. "How is he doing that? Wandless minor animation charm?" "He's not supposed to be able to do it yet. The wandless part is theoretically advanced magic, but Ron's spatial kinetic magic is apparently off the charts, and he keeps doing things he's not supposed to be able to do and then looking surprised about it." Tony started down the corridor. "Hermione's been charting it. She has a theory about undeveloped magical aptitude manifesting under low stress conditions. It's probably going to be a paper someday." Fury followed him, and Hill followed Fury, and Coulson followed Hill with the precise footsteps of a man cataloging the dimensions of the hallway. The living room was occupied. Hermione was at the kitchen counter with a stark pad and 3 paper notebooks open simultaneously, which even Hill looked at with something approaching professional respect. Neville was in the window seat with a tray of seedlings he'd started in the window boxes, carefully transplanting something small and green with a focus that blocked out the rest of the room entirely. Harry was on the couch with what appeared to be a disassembled Stark pad component that Tony had given him to look at, not a sensitive one, and a diagram of its internal structure that he'd hand-drawn with reasonable accuracy. Fury took all of this in. Tony watched him do it. Director Fury. Tony said, "This is Hermione Granger, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley." Ron had returned and was now holding the paper airplane and looking at Fury with frank appraisal, and Neville Longbottom. "Hi," said Harry. "Hello," said Hermione, not looking up. "Watcher," said Ron. Neville looked up, saw Fury's eye patch, looked immediately back at his seedlings, and then looked up again because apparently his curiosity overrode his shyness by a narrow margin. "Hello," he said. Fury, to his credit, had the sense not to try to take command of the room. He sat down in the chair Tony indicated, folded his hands, and looked at the children in the uncomplicated way of someone who had decided to observe before acting. Hill took a position near the window that was definitely not tactical. Coulson remained standing near the kitchen counter and said to Hermione very quietly, "Is that the new Stark Pad Pro with the atmospheric pressure interface?" Hermione looked at him. "Yes, though I've found the predictive text algorithm has a systematic bias toward American English spellings that Jarvis has been helping me adjust." "Jarvis can edit the predictive algorithm." "Jarvis can do most things if you ask him politely and give him clear parameters," Hermione said, looking back at her work. "He responds well to logical framing." Coulson looked at the ceiling where the nearest Jarvis interface node was. "Is that true?" "Agent Coulson," Jarvis said, "you left a handwritten note thanking me after the incident in January. I've had a favorable disposition toward you since." Coulson looked pleased in the way that was almost entirely invisible. Tony decided to let the room do what it was doing, which was, apparently, sorting itself out without his intervention. He poured coffee, handed a mug to Fury, and sat on the edge of the kitchen counter. "Well," Tony said. "Well," Fury agreed. They watched Ron demonstrate the paper airplane to Hill, who maintained professional neutrality for approximately 45 seconds before the airplane performed a loop-the-loop around her head, and she said flatly, "Do that again." Ron did it 3 more times, grinning. Fury said quietly to Tony, "The Potter kid. What about him?" "He hasn't moved from that couch since we walked in. He's been watching every doorway, every person in the room. He marked Hill's position when she shifted, and he clocked the distance to the exit before he looked at anything else." "I know," Tony said. "That's not normal 11-year-old behavior." "No," Tony said. "It's not." Fury looked at Harry, who had returned his attention to the Stark Pad diagram with the focused calm of someone who had decided Tony and Fury were not an immediate variable. "What's his situation?" "Complicated." Tony met Fury's eye. "And not something that gets discussed at first meetings or second ones." Fury held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, which was, Tony knew, as close as Nick Fury got to understood. The incident happened 40 minutes into the visit. It was, in Tony's later assessment, completely avoidable if he had thought for more than 15 seconds about the combination of Ron Weasley, unsupervised curiosity, and the shield-secured tablet that Hill had put down on the end table when she bent to examine Hermione's resonance chart. The tablet was shield property, level 4 clearance. It had a biometric lock, a signal scrambler, and a remote wipe function that activated on unauthorized access. It looked, to an 11-year-old from a world without electronics, like an interesting flat rectangle. Ron picked it up. Hill turned around. "Don't," Hill said. Ron, alarmed by her tone, did what apparently came naturally under stress. He used magic. "Wingardium Leviosa?" Ron said, quite possibly without thinking, and the tablet rose smoothly 4 feet into the air, hovered, and then did something that none of Tony's instruments had predicted but probably should have. The magical levitation field interacted with the tablet's internal electromagnetic security architecture, produced a resonance cascade that Jarvis later described as genuinely unprecedented. And the tablet emitted a brief but intense burst of electromagnetic energy that did the following things. In order, wiped its own hard drive, disrupted the building's Wi-Fi on floors 48 through 54, triggered the remote alert at S.H.I.E.L.D.'s New York headquarters, and caused every single one of Tony's workshop monitors to display, briefly and inexplicably, a screensaver of a rubber duck that Tony had definitely not programmed, and which Jarvis could not explain, and which they never fully accounted for. The tablet descended gently to the floor. Ron stared at it. The room was very quiet. "I didn't mean to," Ron said. "Jarvis," Tony said, very calmly. "All data on the tablet was wiped on contact with the levitation field," Jarvis reported. "This is consistent with the tablet's own emergency protocol, which was triggered by the unusual electromagnetic signature. Technically, sir, the tablet wiped itself. Ron's spell simply provided the triggering condition." "So it's not Ron's fault," Tony said. "It is and it isn't. In the way that a key is and isn't responsible for opening a lock." Fury looked at the tablet on the floor. He looked at Ron. Ron was bright red and holding his wand in both hands with the guilty expression of someone who was very familiar with the guilty expression and had been practicing it since approximately age 4. "I'm really sorry," Ron said. "I'm dead sorry. It looked interesting, and then you made a noise and he looked at Tony. "I'll fix it. Reparo works on most things if it's just, the data's gone," Hill said. She wasn't angry exactly. She was using the voice of someone performing anger management in real time successfully through sheer professionalism. "The drive is wiped." "What was on it?" Tony asked. A pause. Hill glanced at Fury. "Quarterly assessment reports," Fury said. "Paperwork," Tony said. "Sensitive, paperwork." Tony said again. "Jarvis, were any of those files on S.H.I.E.L.D.'s remote servers as well?" "All S.H.I.E.L.D. filed documents are automatically backed up to 3 separate servers," Jarvis said, with the air of someone who had prepared for exactly this question. "The loss is the local copy only." Fury looked at Jarvis's nearest interface node. "I want one of those," Fury said. "I'll put it on the list," Tony said, which was the list of things he was never going to do. "Ron!" Ron looked at him miserably. "Did you learn something?" Tony asked. "Don't touch things that aren't mine." Ron said, instantly, "In this specific context, don't perform levitation charms on objects that contain electronics. The magical field interacts with EM-shielded hardware in ways we don't fully understand yet." Tony picked up the tablet, looked at it. "Actually, that was useful data. Jarvis, log the resonance pattern from that interaction." "Already done, sir." "We'll call it a controlled experiment," Tony said, setting the tablet on the counter. "It was not a controlled experiment," Hill said. "Retrospectively controlled," Tony said. "The best kind." Hill looked at him with an expression suggesting she was reevaluating several things she'd believed about the nature of human accountability. Ron looked at Tony with an expression suggesting he was also reevaluating several things of a different kind. Fury left an hour later, at which point Coulson had somehow ended up in a quiet conversation with Harry about the Stark pad component, explaining how the internal gyroscope worked. And Harry was asking follow-up questions with the focused precision that Tony was beginning to understand, was simply how Harry operated when he felt safe enough to be curious. Coulson, Tony noted, was excellent with him. No performance, no condescension, no excessive warmth. Just information, clearly delivered, genuine attention to the questions. Tony made a mental note of the kind he didn't make consciously but which registered anyway. At the elevator, Fury turned. "Stark," he said. "Fury, the boy, Potter." He kept his voice low, though the kids were out of earshot. "The EM pulse thing Jarvis mentioned in your security brief." Tony had, it turned out, included more in the security brief than he'd intended. He was going to have a word with his past self about that. "What about it?" Tony said. "It correlates with his stress responses. I watched it on the monitors. Every time he scanned a new part of the room it spiked." Fury met Tony's eyes. "That's not just a magic thing. That's a trauma response that happens to have a magical expression." Tony said nothing. "I've seen that profile," Fury said. "In adults. Usually takes years of active combat to produce it in an adult." He paused. "He's 11. "I'm aware," Tony said. "Are you also aware that I have resources? I'm not bringing S.H.I.E.L.D. into his personal situation. I was going to say I have resources I could offer quietly. Therapists with appropriate clearance. People who have worked with, I'll source my own," Tony said. "But," he stopped, "it cost him something." "Thank you." Fury nodded once, stepped into the elevator. "Stark," he said as the doors began to close. "Yeah, the rubber duck." Tony looked at him. "Don't look at me," Tony said. "Look at Jarvis." "I have no information on that," Jarvis said from the elevator panel entirely too quickly. The doors closed. Tony stood in the corridor for a moment. "Jarvis," he said. "Sir, the rubber duck." A pause of approximately 2 seconds, which on Jarvis's timescale was an eternity. "Ron asked me last night," Jarvis said, "if I could do anything fun. I may have been preparing for an appropriate moment." Tony stared at the elevator doors. "You planned it." "I timed it, sir. There's a distinction." "The classified S.H.I.E.L.D. tablet." The electromagnetic interaction was real and scientifically significant. I simply had the screensaver ready in case an opportunity arose. Tony thought about this. Jarvis, he said. Sir. That was, Tony said, genuinely excellent. Thank you, sir. Don't do it again. Of course not, sir. A pause. Probably, Tony added. Understood completely, sir, Jarvis said. That night, after dinner, which Tony had cooked, a fact Ron found more astonishing than the dimensional travel, the five of them ended up in the lab. Not by plan. It had just migrated there, the way evenings sometimes do, following the gravity of whoever's most absorbed in something. Hermione and Tony were at the whiteboard, extending the resonance model. Harry was in the corner chair with a Stark engineering textbook he'd found on the shelf, reading it with the patient attention of someone who didn't know all the words yet, but wasn't going to let that stop them. Ron was watching Jarvis's holographic display of Manhattan with his chin in his hand. The city laid out in blue light, rivers of data running through it. Neville had brought a seedling in and set it on the end of the workbench and was talking to it very quietly, which Tony had stopped questioning. "Can I ask you something?" Ron said to Jarvis, or possibly to the room. "Of course," Jarvis said, "all those lights." Ron gestured at the holo Manhattan. "All those buildings, they're all," he made a gesture that meant powered, running, alive. All the time," Jarvis confirmed. Ron shook his head slowly. "In our world, you'd need hundreds of wizards to maintain something like that, working constantly. Our whole world it's mostly dark, really. You have to make the light yourself." He looked at the display. "And here it just is." "Does that bother you?" Tony asked from the whiteboard. Ron thought about it seriously. "No, it's brilliant." A pause. "It just makes me wonder what we've been doing all this time. Like, we've had magic for thousands of years and we still travel by broomstick. You've had electricity for 150 years and look at all of it." "Magic and technology solve the same problems differently," Hermione said, not looking up from the whiteboard. "It's not a hierarchy." "I know," Ron said. "I'm not saying one's better, I'm just—" He looked at the city. "I'm just thinking." Tony looked at Ron. He thought of a kid who'd grown up with 6 siblings in a house that ran on love and limited resources, who'd been handed a world that worked differently than his from birth, and had never questioned whether his version might be limiting him. "Ron," Tony said, "do you know what your magical aptitude actually is? Has anyone tested it?" Ron made a face. "I'm not the smart one, that's Hermione." "That's not what I asked. I'm not the talented one either, that's Harry, everyone knows." "Ron." Tony set down the marker. "The wandless animation charms. The levitation today. Jarvis has been logging your output since you got here. You want to see the numbers?" Ron looked at him uncertainly. Tony nodded at Jarvis, who put the comparative magical output chart on the display. Ron stared at it. His numbers were, in raw terms, the highest in the room. Not dramatically, the margin was within the standard deviation of an insufficiently large sample, but the trend was clear. Ron stared at the chart for a long time. "That can't be right," he said. "Jarvis doesn't make instrumentation errors," Tony said. "Not in the logging phase." "But I'm not. I always mess up spells. I break things." "I'm the one who you break things," Tony said, "because you're generating more output than your wand is calibrated to handle. It's not a skill problem, it's a hardware mismatch." Ron stared at him. "Think of it like this," Tony said. "You've got a power source that could run a city block, and you've been plugging it into a lamp." Ron opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the chart. "Huh," Ron said. "Yeah," Tony said. Hermione was looking at the chart now too, with the expression of someone who was recontextualizing several years of observations. Harry was watching Ron from the corner chair with quiet attention and something that might have been relief or recognition. Neville, without looking up from his seedling, said, "I could have told you that. He lit up every diagnostic Professor Sprout ever ran. She just never said anything to him because she wasn't sure what to do about it." Ron turned to look at Neville. "You never told me that," Ron said. "You never asked," Neville said simply. Ron sat with this for a moment. Then he looked back at the city in the holographic display, all those lights that just were, and Tony watched something quiet happen in his expression, Not dramatic, not sudden, just a door opening somewhere that had been shut for a while. "So what do I do about the wand?" Ron asked. "Get a better one," Tony said. "One calibrated to your actual output. Where do I get that?" "I have some ideas," Hermione said. "I have some ideas too," Tony said, "and mine involve science, so between the two of us we'll figure it out." Ron looked between them. "You're going to build me a wand?" Ron said. "A scientific wand." "I'm going to help build you a better focusing mechanism," Tony said. "The magic is yours. I'm just the engineering." Ron's face broke into a grin so wide and uncomplicated it briefly rearranged the atmosphere in the room. "Wicked," Ron said, for the second time since he'd arrived, and this time it had a different kind of weight to it. Later, after the others had gone to bed, Tony stood at the lab window with his coffee and looked at the city below. All those lights that just were, running on stored effects, on systematized understanding, on 150 years of people who'd looked at the dark and decided to build something against it. He thought about 4 kids asleep in the rooms he'd designed for them. He thought about locks that only worked from the inside, and charts that proved things nobody had told you, and seedlings that grew better when you talked to them, and a city that blazed all night so no one had to make the light themselves. He thought. Temporary, he thought. "Yeah, right. Jarvis?" He said. "Sir, add the kids to the building's priority systems, emergency protocols, biometric access, the works. As permanent residents, sir," Tony looked at the city. "As permanent residents," he said. Chapter 6. Standardized testing is no match for Hermione Granger. The school was called Westbridge Academy, and it had a waiting list 18 months long, an acceptance rate of 12%, and a headmistress named Dr. Patricia Osai, who had, according to Pepper's research, a doctorate in educational psychology, 20 years of experience with gifted children, and the disposition of someone who had dealt with every possible variety of difficult parent and was not going to be rattled by Tony Stark. She was almost right about that last part. Tony arrived with all 4 kids on a Monday morning in a car that was aggressively not a limousine, because Pepper had suggested that leading with the limousine might set a tone. And Tony had agreed in the sense that he'd showed up in something that cost 3 times as much as a limousine but looked like a normal car, which he felt was a reasonable compromise. Dr. Osai met them in the lobby. She was a tall woman in her 50s with close cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the energy of someone who ran on competence the way other people ran on caffeine. She looked at Tony. She looked at the 4 children, Hermione with her notebook already out, Ron looking at the trophy cases with open curiosity, Neville examining a potted plant near the entrance with professional attention, Harry watching the room. "Mr. Stark," she said, "I've reviewed your application, and," Tony said, "and I have questions." She looked at the kids. "Why don't I show you the campus while we talk?" The campus tour was conducted at Dr. Osai's pace, which was brisk and purposeful. She talked as she walked, describing the curriculum, the class structure, the support systems, the expectations. Tony walked beside her. The kids followed, and Tony tracked them in his peripheral vision, Hermione absorbing everything, Ron reading every notice board they passed, Neville identifying the species of every plant in the corridor planters under his breath, Harry mapping the building. "Your documentation indicates the children are British nationals," Dr. Osai said. "Correct. Currently under your emergency guardianship." "Correct." "Their previous schooling was," she glanced at her folder, "informal and non-standard." "That's one way to put it," Tony said. "They're smart kids. All 4 of them in different ways. They need structure and they need to be challenged. They're not getting either right now. You've had them for less than 2 weeks. I'm a fast reader of situations." Dr. Osai looked at him sideways. "Mr. Stark, I want to be clear that Westbridge Academy does not have a celebrity admissions track. We assess every student on their own merits." "Good," Tony said. "That's what I want." She paused, looked at him more carefully, apparently recalibrating something. "We'd need to run placement assessments before we could discuss enrollment. Given the non-standard schooling background, the gaps may be significant. The gaps in some areas may be significant, Tony agreed. The ceiling in others is going to be a problem for your curriculum design. I'd prepare your assessment team. Dr. Osai looked at Hermione, who had filled 2 pages of her notebook during the tour without appearing to look down at it once. How old is she? Dr. Osai asked. 11, Tony said. Dr. Osai looked at the notebook. Prepare my assessment team? She repeated thoughtfully. That's what I said. The placement assessments were scheduled for the following Thursday, which gave Tony a week to prepare the kids for the specific texture of standardized Muggle academic testing. This went differently for each of them. Hermione did not need preparation. Hermione needed, if anything, to be gently walked back from the edge of over-preparation. Because by Tuesday she had sourced the New York State 6th grade curriculum standards, the Common Core Mathematics Framework, the standardized literacy benchmarks for ages 10 through 14, and 3 separate academic papers on the psychometric validity of placement testing in multilingual and multicultural educational contexts. You're 11, Tony said, looking at the stack. The psychometric paper is very accessible, Hermione said. The methodology is straightforward. It's essentially applied statistics, and the sample sizes in the validation studies are, Hermione. Yes, you're going to be fine on the test. I know, she said. But I want to understand the test's own internal assumptions about what constitutes knowledge, because if the assessment framework has blind spots, I should account for them in my. Hermione, Tony said. Read something fun. She looked at him. What? She said. Something you're reading because you want to, not because you're preparing for something. Do you do that? A pause that was slightly too long. I'm always preparing for something, she said. Tony looked at her. What do you read when you can't sleep and it's 2 a.m. and no one's watching? A longer pause. Arithmancy, she said quietly. The advanced theory, it's like mathematics, but it describes magical principles through number systems, and I find it. She stopped. It's just interesting. Bring it, Tony said. Sit on the lab couch and read it. I'll be working. No one's going to quiz you on it. She looked at him carefully. That's allowed, she asked. Reading for fun, Tony said. Generally considered a baseline human activity. Ron reads for fun, she said with faint surprise, as if this had only just occurred to her. He reads Quidditch strategy manuals. He's read the same one about 12 times. See, fun reading is real, Quidditch is a sport. And arithmancy theory is mathematics. They're both things you're reading because they interest you. Tony turned back to his workbench. That's the same thing. Hermione stood there for a moment. Then, very quietly, she went and got her arithmancy book and sat on the lab couch and read it. And after about 10 minutes, the careful preparation posture went out of her shoulders, and she was just reading just that. And Tony did not comment on it. Harry's preparation was functional and specific. Tony walked him through the test format, explained multiple-choice methodology, covered the pacing strategy for time-limited sections, and identified that Harry's written literacy was strong, but his mathematics had significant gaps from a Muggle curriculum perspective, because Hogwarts apparently covered a lot of things, but algebraic reasoning was not among them. They spent 3 evenings on algebra. Harry learned fast, not with Hermione's instant total absorption, but with a steady systematic quality that Tony recognized. The kind of learner who builds frameworks rather than collecting facts, who understands why something works before accepting that it does. Why does the variable go on the left? Harry asked on the second evening. Convention, Tony said, not a reason. It's the standard notation, but it could go on the right. It could, so it's arbitrary. Mathematical notation is largely arbitrary. The underlying logic isn't. Harry thought about this. So when people write it on the right, it's still right. Mathematically, yes, you'd lose marks on a standardized test because the marker's looking for the convention. That seems like testing the convention rather than the mathematics. Tony looked at him. Yeah, Tony said. That's a fair critique of standardized testing. Harry wrote the variable on the left clearly and moved on with the air of someone who had filed a reasonable objection and was continuing anyway because the system was the system. Tony thought, God, this kid is going to be exhausting and wonderful. Ron's preparation was the most interesting. The academic gap was real. Ron had a solid foundation in magical history and theory, reasonable literacy, and an extraordinary intuitive grasp of spatial and strategic problems. But the Muggle mathematics and science curriculum was largely foreign territory. Tony spent an afternoon assessing where the edges were. Fractions, Tony said, writing one on the whiteboard. I know fractions, Ron said, slightly defensive. 3/7 plus 2/5. Ron looked at it, started adding numerators, stopped, looked at the denominators, made a face. They don't match, he said. Right, so what do you do? In cooking you just, he stopped. Mum does fractions all the time when she's scaling recipes. She finds he stared at the board. She finds the number both of them go into. Common denominator, Tony said. Right, so 35. Ron wrote it out slowly and got the right answer. You knew how to do it, Tony said. I didn't know the name for it. The name is just a label, the operation you already had. Tony underlined the answer. That's going to be the pattern, Ron. You probably know more of this than you think. You've just been learning it attached to different labels. Ron looked at the fraction. Mum's a better maths teacher than she knows, he said, with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with himself. Tony nodded. Tell her that when you see her. Ron's expression shifted briefly into something that was partly longing and partly determination, and he looked back at the whiteboard and said, Okay, what's next? Neville's preparation took a different shape entirely, because Neville's specific difficulty was not the content of the test, but his relationship to the act of being tested. Tony figured this out on day 2 when he sat down with Neville to run through a practice paper, and Neville answered the first 3 questions correctly, paused at the 4th, crossed out a correct answer, replaced it with a wrong one, and looked at the paper with the expression of someone who had been making this specific mistake long enough that they couldn't see it anymore. Stop, Tony said. Neville stopped. Read question 4 again. Neville, read it. What's your first instinct? 42, Neville said. Is 42 the answer? Yes, but I thought I might be. Neville. Tony waited until the boy was looking at him. What made you cross it out? Neville was quiet for a moment. I was sure, he said finally, and I'm usually wrong when I'm sure, so I changed it. Tony looked at the practice paper, looked at Neville, at the careful, round-faced boy who carried his plant everywhere not as an eccentricity, but because it was the thing he was most consistently right about, the domain where his certainty had never been punished. Who told you that you were usually wrong? Tony asked. Neville looked at the table. Nobody had to, he said. Tony understood then, the accumulation of it. Years of being the slow one, the one who couldn't manage the spell, the one who was at Hogwarts by the grace of his grandmother's expectations rather than his own ability. The conclusion a person drew from that, if they were Neville, wasn't I am being taught badly or the system isn't calibrated for my aptitude. The conclusion was my instincts are unreliable. Neville, Tony said, in the last 2 weeks, how many times have you been wrong about your plants? Neville blinked. What? Your plants, your botanical instincts, how often wrong? Neville thought. I mean, the propagation timing for the cutting was slightly off. I'd said 3 days and it took 4, but structural errors, fundamental calls. I don't, not often, almost never really. Not with plants. Your certainty works, Tony said, when you let it. He pointed at question 4. Write 42. Neville wrote 42. Now don't change it, Tony said. On the real test, on every question, whatever you write first, do not change it. Promise me. Neville looked uncertain. Promise me, Tony said. Okay, Neville said. I promise. Good. Tony moved to the next question. Now, what's your first instinct on this one? Neville looked at it. Photosynthesis, he said immediately. Correct, Tony said. Something shifted in Neville's face, very small. Like a plant angling toward a light source it had only just noticed. Thursday arrived. Dr. Osai's assessment team consisted of 3 evaluators. one for literacy and verbal reasoning, one for mathematics and logical reasoning, and one for general science knowledge. They were expecting standard placement results for non-standard schooled students, a phrase that, in Tony's experience, was educational administration code for probably fine, but let's manage expectations. Tony sat in the waiting area with a coffee and his phone, reading the resonance extraction model notes Hermione had annotated the night before. The test was scheduled for 2 hours. It took Hermione 53 minutes. The evaluator came out of the assessment room looking like a person who had just witnessed something that gently violated their understanding of 11-year-olds. She sat down beside Tony. "Mr. Stark," she said. "How'd she do?" Tony said, not looking up. "She finished." "I know, she's fast." "She finished and then a pause. She wrote notes." "On what?" "On the test, in the margins." The evaluator opened the assessment booklet. In Hermione's small, precise handwriting, alongside several of the science questions, were annotations ranging from "this question assumes Newtonian mechanics," without accounting for relativistic effects at relevant scales. "Answer given is correct within stated parameters to the reading passage contains a factual error in paragraph 3 regarding the date of the Magna Carta. This doesn't affect the comprehension questions, but seems worth noting." Tony looked at the Magna Carta note. "Is she right?" he asked. The evaluator pulled out her phone and looked it up. She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," the evaluator said. "Okay," Tony said, and went back to his notes. Harry finished in 90 minutes, scored in the 94th percentile across all areas, with a specific flag from the mathematics evaluator that his algebraic reasoning was unusually methodical for his age group, in a way that suggests strong, systematic thinking. Ron finished in the full 2 hours, having, as far as Tony could tell from the evaluator's report, spent the last 20 minutes doing the test backwards from the end because he'd finished and had time to kill, and scored in the 78th percentile, which was well above grade level and caused the evaluator to say his spatial reasoning subscore is, and then show Tony a number that was in the 99th percentile. "He'll want to know that," Tony said. "Should I? I'll tell him," Tony said. "He'll need to hear it from someone he trusts before he believes it." Neville finished in 95 minutes, and his score, when the evaluator showed Tony, was solidly above grade level, including a perfect score on the biology and natural science section. He had not changed a single answer. "He wrote something at the top of his paper," the evaluator said, showing Tony at the top of Neville's assessment booklet in careful letters. "First instinct, don't change it." Tony looked at that for a moment. "Yeah," Tony said, "he did great." Dr. Osai called Tony into her office at noon. She sat behind her desk. She had the 4 assessment reports in front of her. She looked at them, then at Tony, with the expression of a person updating their model of a situation in real time. "Hermione Granger," she said. "Yes," Tony said. "She belongs in a 9th or 10th grade curriculum for most subjects, possibly higher for mathematics and science." "I know, she's 11. I know." "Does she know?" "She knows she's advanced," Tony said. "She doesn't always know it's to the extent that it is. I'd appreciate if the framing when you tell her is about opportunity rather than exception. She's had enough of being the exception." Dr. Osai looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, the professional assessment recalibrating into something more personal. "Harry Potter," she said. "Strong, systematic thinker, needs to trust his own reasoning. He second-guesses himself not because he's uncertain about the answer, but because he's learned to expect that being right gets noticed in the wrong way." Dr. Osai wrote something down. "Ronald Weasley," she said. 99th percentile spatial reasoning. Undersold himself in writing because he doesn't think of himself as the smart one. He is. Different kind of smart, but it's there and it's significant. And Neville Longbottom. Tony thought about the note at the top of the paper. "Neville," he said, "is going to surprise people for the rest of his life. I'd recommend making sure Westbridge is the first place that's surprised in a way that helps rather than hurts." Dr. Osai was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Stark," she said. When you applied, I'll be honest, I expected a particular kind of conversation. A donation conversation. A pull-some-strings conversation. I know, Tony said. This has been a different kind of conversation. Yeah, Tony said. She looked at the 4 reports on her desk. We can enroll them. She said, with tailored curriculum plans, we'll need a few weeks to design the frameworks properly. She paused. And I'll want regular check-ins. This is an unusual situation and I want to make sure we're serving them. I want the same thing, Tony said. She stood, extended her hand. Tony shook it. One question, she said. Sure. The margin notes on the assessment booklet. She looked at the Magna Carta annotation. The factual error she flagged, I've checked 3 additional sources. And, Tony said, she's correct. I know, Tony said, she usually is. On the way home, in the car that wasn't a limousine, Ron said, So, how'd we do? Tony looked at the 4 of them. Hermione carefully not asking, Harry watching Tony's face, Neville looking out the window, Ron projecting studied casualness in the way of someone who cared a lot. You're all in. Tony said, Enrolled. Ron pumped his fist. Hermione exhaled just once, just quietly, and looked out her window at the city. Harry said, When do we start? 2 weeks. They're designing curriculum plans. For all of us, Neville asked. Tailored for each of you, Tony said. To fit what you actually need. Neville processed this. Nobody's ever done that before, he said. Made something fit us. Tony looked out the windshield at the city ahead. Well, he said, first time for everything. That evening, Jarvis quietly updated the building's resident files. 4 new entries, permanent status. Educational institution. Westbridge Academy, enrollment pending. And under each name, in the field labeled notes, Jarvis had added a single line, unprompted without being asked, in the small self-expressive way that Jarvis had been developing for years, and Tony had long since stopped pretending not to notice, under Hermione, reading for fun. Arithmancy. Under Ron, 99th percentile. Tell him again, under Neville, first instinct. Don't change it, under Harry, systematic thinker. Trusts Tony's lab. Tony found it at midnight when he was reviewing the system logs. He sat with it for a moment. Then he added 1 line of his own at the bottom of the file in the field labeled Guardian Notes. They're going to be fine. He thought about it, deleted going to be, they're fine. He closed the file. Went back to the resonance model. Outside, Manhattan blazed on. Chapter 7. First week Monday arrived the way first days always do, with the specific quality of time moving both too fast and too slow, and the feeling that the ordinary clothes you'd picked out the night before had somehow become the wrong choice overnight. Tony drove them himself. This was not the plan. The plan had been a car service, professional, low profile. Pepper had arranged it. But at 7:45 a.m., Tony had come downstairs to find all 4 of them in the kitchen in various states of readiness. Hermione completely prepared and vibrating with contained energy. Ron eating toast with the methodical focus of someone carb, loading for a marathon. Neville straightening his jacket for the 4th time. Harry sitting very still with his school bag already on his back, like he'd been ready for an hour, and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. And Tony had looked at them and said to Jarvis, quietly, Cancel the car service, and grabbed his keys. Nobody commented on this. They drove through Manhattan in the not a limousine with the radio on low. Ron watched the city go by with his face close to the window. Hermione reviewed her schedule. Neville held his bag on his lap with both hands. Harry said, at a red light, What if they're awful? The kids or the teachers? Tony asked. Either. Tony thought about this with genuine seriousness, because Harry asked genuine questions and deserved genuine answers. Then you come home and tell me who specifically was awful and we make a plan, Tony said. School is mandatory. Awful people are a solvable problem. Harry thought about this. Okay, he said. You've dealt with worse, Tony said. Harry looked at him sideways. You don't know what I've dealt with, Harry said, not defensively, just factually. I know enough, Tony said. The light turned green. Dr. Osai met them at the entrance, which Tony had specifically asked her to do. because walking into a school for the first time was a threshold moment, and threshold moments benefited from a known quantity on the other side. She walked them through the building, not the same tour as before, a different one, a "this is yours now" tour, where the lockers were, which bathroom was closest to which classroom, where the library was, which Hermione located on the map and marked with a small star before Dr. Osai had finished the sentence. She introduced them to their homeroom teacher, a young man named Mr. Vasquez, who had the energy of someone who had chosen teaching because he genuinely liked 11-year-olds and had not yet had that enthusiasm fully tested. He was about to have it tested. "Good morning," Mr. Vasquez said. "I'm really glad to have you all. I thought we'd start with some quick introductions. Just tell us a bit about yourselves, something you're interested in." He looked at Hermione first, because she was already sitting at the front center desk with her notebook out, which created a certain gravitational inevitability. Hermione stood up. She said, "My name is Hermione Granger. I'm 11. I'm from England. I'm interested in magical, in theoretical applied mathematics, physical chemistry, botanical sciences, advanced literature, the history of scientific methodology, and most recently the intersection of electromagnetic field theory with non-standard energy systems." She paused. "I'm also working through the psychometric literature on standardized assessment validity, but that's more of a side interest at the moment." Mr. Vasquez looked at her. "That's great." He said, "That's a lot of interests." "I know," Hermione said, sitting back down. "I'm working on prioritizing." Mr. Vasquez moved to Ron, who stood up and said, "Ron Weasley, I like chess and, well, I like most things if they're interesting enough." He glanced at the window. "Do you have a sports program here?" "We have several," Mr. Vasquez said. "What kind?" "Football, baseball, basketball, track." "Chess team," Ron said. "Yes, actually." "Right." Ron sat down satisfied. "I'll probably do that then, and whatever else." "Have you played American football before, Mr. Vasquez asked. "I've played Quidditch," Ron said, and then very smoothly added, "It's a British sport, similar principle." Tony, who was not present because he'd left them at the door, would have appreciated that. Neville stood up when his turn came and said, quietly, "Neville Longbottom, I'm interested in plants, and botany and herbology." He paused. "That's the same thing said twice, sorry. I really like plants." "We have a school garden," Mr. Vasquez offered. Neville looked up. "You do? Upper courtyard. It's been a bit neglected, honestly. I can fix that," Neville said with a quiet certainty that was new, and then seemed to realize how it sounded and added, if that would be all right." "I think that would be great," Mr. Vasquez said. Neville sat down and looked at his hands, but his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was pleased and trying not to show it. Harry stood last. He said, "Harry Potter, I like solving problems." A pause. He glanced at where the computer lab would be, based on Dr. Osai's tour map. "I'm interested in how things work." "Specifically?" Mr. Vasquez asked. Harry thought about it. "Everything, mostly, but especially things that shouldn't work but do anyway." Mr. Vasquez smiled. "I think you'll fit in well here." Harry sat down and looked at his desk, and Tony, who genuinely was not present, would have noticed the small, private quality of his expression. The kind that happens when someone says something kind and accurate, and you don't quite know what to do with it. The computer lab incident happened at 10:43 a.m., 43 minutes into second period. Mr. Vasquez had taken them to the lab for a basic digital literacy session, routine for new students, especially those with non-standard educational backgrounds. The room had 30 workstations in rows, all running, all humming with the specific frequency of institutional computing infrastructure. Harry sat down at a workstation. The computer next to him flickered. Harry looked at it. It flickered again. Harry, reasonably, reached out to adjust the monitor cable. The moment his hand touched the metal casing, the electromagnetic pulse, which Harry's nervous system generated at baseline and which spiked predictably on tactile contact with conductive materials. A fact Tony had documented but the school had not yet been briefed on. Discharged through the workstation. This would have been manageable. Tony had calibrated the acceptable range, and a single workstation discharge was within it, except that the workstations were networked. The pulse traveled the network cable at approximately the speed of electricity. 30 workstations flickered, rebooted, and came back online in sequence like a wave, which created a visual effect that Mr. Vasquez would later describe as like something from a film. Honestly, it was almost beautiful. The wave reached the router. The router rebooted. The school's internet went offline for 11 minutes. In the silence that followed, 30 students looked at Harry. Harry looked at his hands. "Sorry," he said to the room. Static electricity. I get a lot of static electricity." The student next to him, a girl with braided hair and an expression of scientific curiosity rather than alarm, said, "That was so cool." "It really wasn't," Harry said. "It kind of was," she said. "The internet is down," Harry said. "The internet goes down all the time," she said. "It's never looked that cool before." Her name, Harry would learn, was Zara Ahmed. She was 11. She was interested in electrical engineering, and she was going to become Harry's first friend at Westbridge Academy in approximately the next 4 minutes, during which time she would explain to Harry that the school's router had needed replacing for 2 years, and he'd probably done IT a favor. Harry looked at her. "Does everything here break this interestingly?" he asked. "Most things just break boringly," Zara said, "but you seem different." "Yeah," Harry said with a complicated expression. "I am." Hermione's first academic disagreement happened at 1:15 p.m. in advanced science, which she'd been placed into based on her assessment scores. The teacher was Mr. Chandra, who was experienced, well-read, confident in his subject, and about to learn something about himself. He was explaining photosynthesis. Hermione waited. She waited through the basic explanation. She waited through the diagram. She waited through the worksheet. She raised her hand exactly once at the moment when Mr. Chandra said, "And that's really all we need to know about chlorophyll absorption at this level." "Mr. Chandra," Hermione said. "Yes, Hermione." "The absorption spectrum you've drawn shows the peak at 680 nanometers for chlorophyll A, which is correct. But the diagram omits the secondary peak at 700 nanometers for chlorophyll in its excited state, which is functionally significant for understanding the light harvesting complex efficiency." She paused. "I'm not saying the simplification is wrong for the purposes of this lesson. I just wanted to flag it in case any of us wanted to look further." Mr. Chandra looked at her. The class looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Mr. Chandra with the expression of someone who had genuinely meant this as collaborative and was now reading the room and recalibrating. "That's technically accurate," Mr. Chandra said carefully. "Yes," Hermione said. "I thought it might be useful to mention. For a student at this level, the simplified model is completely appropriate. Yes, I understand that." She looked at her worksheet, back at him. "I wasn't challenging the model. I find the full complexity more interesting than the simplification, and I thought perhaps others might too." She paused. "I'm sorry if that was disruptive." She sounded like she meant the apology. She also sounded like she'd delivered that apology before in that specific way many times. Mr. Chandra looked at her for a moment. He was a good teacher. This was evidenced by what he did next, which was, he put down his marker, looked at the class, and said, "Hermione's made a good point. Let me add the excited state peak to the diagram." He did. 3 students leaned forward. Hermione very quietly exhaled. "After class, Mr. Chandra stopped her on the way out. "Hermione," he said. She turned with the posture of someone bracing. "You were right," he said, "and you were right to say it. My classroom has room for that." He paused. "I just ask that we find a way to do it that brings the class along. Does that make sense?" Hermione looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "that makes sense." "Good." He turned back to his desk. "And Hermione, the light harvesting complex. Look up the Fenner-Matthews-Olson complex this evening if you haven't already. I think you'll find it interesting." Hermione stood still for 2 seconds. "Thank you," she said, and there was something in it that was larger than the words. Ron's day was objectively the most socially successful. which would have surprised anyone who'd met Ron for 5 minutes and would have surprised Ron most of all. It happened because of chess. At lunch, in the cafeteria, Ron had spotted a chessboard in the corner of the room where two boys were playing a game that Ron assessed in approximately 10 seconds as competent but conservative. Neither player was taking risks. Both were playing not to lose rather than to win. And the resulting game was technically sound and completely airless. Ron, who had been raised by a father who treated the breakfast table as a tactical exercise and brothers who had made losing gracefully into a competitive sport, watched for about 30 seconds and then said, to nobody in particular, "He's going to lose in 4 moves." The boy playing black looked up. "Who is?" he said. "You," Ron said. 4 moves, maybe 5 if you castle now, but it won't help because you've already," he pointed at the board. "You've left your queen's bishop exposed, and he's setting up a discovered attack from the knight." The boy playing black stared at the board, stared at it longer. "Oh," he said very quietly. "Oh no." "Yeah," Ron said. "Sorry. Can you show me," the boy said, "how to get out of it?" Ron looked at the empty seat across from him, sat down. What happened next was, by multiple accounts from students who'd been watching from nearby tables, either a masterclass or a performance piece depending on your relationship to chess. Ron played both sides simultaneously, demonstrating the discovered attack, the counter to the counter, narrating all of it in the relaxed running commentary of someone who had been doing this since he could reach a table. By the time he was done, there were 7 students watching. One of them said, "Are you on the chess team?" "Not yet," Ron said. "Can you come to practice Wednesday?" "Sure," Ron said. The boy who'd been playing black, whose name was Marcus, and who would become Ron's closest friend at Westbridge by the end of the month, looked at him with the expression of someone who had been looking for this specific person for some time. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Marcus said. Ron thought about his kitchen table, and his brothers and his dad, and the long rainy Scottish days when there was nothing to do but play. "Home," he said. Neville found the school garden at lunch. It was in the upper courtyard, as Dr. Osai had said, a raised bed garden that had clearly been well designed at some point and had since been maintained by good intentions and insufficient attention. The lavender was woody and overgrown. The rosemary had gone to seed. There were 3 tomato plants that had survived entirely on stubbornness. Neville stood at the gate and looked at it for a while. Then he went in. He didn't have his wand. None of them carried wands to school. They'd agreed on this. It was too complicated. But he had his hands and his knowledge, and the particular quality of attention that made plants respond to Neville Longbottom in ways that were technically explainable, but felt like something more. He deadheaded the lavender without being asked. He found a trowel in the shed at the back and turned the soil around the tomatoes. He identified 3 plants that were salvageable with pruning and 1 that needed to go, and removed the one that needed to go with the respectful practicality of someone who understood that this was what the garden needed. The groundskeeper found him there at the end of lunch. His name was Mr. Ockafer. He was 60-something, and he had the weathered hands and the patient eyes of someone who had been talking to plants for decades without ever finding another person who understood why. He looked at what Neville had done to the lavender. "That's the right cut," Mr. Ockafer said. "It was getting leggy," Neville said. "It needed to be brought back." Mr. Ockafer looked at the turned soil around the tomatoes. "You know what you're doing," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I know plants," Neville said, simply without qualification. The voice of someone who has decided to stop being surprised by their own certainties. Mr. Ockafer nodded slowly. "I come out here Tuesdays and Thursdays," he said. "If you wanted to help." Neville looked at the garden, at the 3 surviving tomatoes, at the lavender already looking more itself. "Yes, please," he said. At 3:45 p.m., Tony was in the lab when Jarvis said, "The children are back, sir." All 4. Also a girl named Zara who Harry has apparently adopted, and a boy named Marcus who Ron beat at chess 6 times and then taught not to be beaten. They're in the elevator. Tony set down his work. "He didn't go to the foyer." He stayed at the workbench, because being at the workbench was normal and he was going for normal. And after a moment he heard them come in. Ron talking loudly, Hermione interjecting, Zara asking Harry a question about electromagnetic fields that Harry was answering with more accuracy than a school-sanctioned answer probably required. They came into the lab in a wave. The internet went down for 11 minutes, Harry said to Tony immediately. Jarvis told me, Tony said. It wasn't, I didn't mean to. I know. We need to brief the school on your EM situation. I'll call Dr. Osai tomorrow. Tony looked up. Anyone else have a notable first day? Hermione corrected a teacher, Ron said. He agreed with me, Hermione said. She corrected a teacher and the teacher agreed with her, Ron said, which is somehow more alarming. Neville made friends with the groundskeeper, Harry said. He knows plants, Neville said with simple satisfaction. We talked for an hour. Ron made the chess team in one lunch, Harry said. I haven't technically made it yet, Ron said. I have to go to practice Wednesday. You made it, Harry said. How was your day? Tony asked Harry. Harry looked at Zara, who was looking at the holographic resonance model with the focused attention of someone filing a detailed internal report. Good, Harry said, and meant it. Zara pointed at the resonance model. What is this? A project, Tony said. Active research. Into what? Energy extraction from an embedded field structure. Zara looked at it with the clinical attention of someone doing preliminary assessment. That's a folded resonance geometry, she said. I've seen diagrams of something similar in my dad's electromagnetic engineering textbooks. Different scale, but the topology is... Tony looked at Harry. Harry looked at Tony. Tony made a decision. You want to know something actually interesting about this model? Obviously, Zara said. Come look at this part. Tony said, and she did, and that was that. And Tony Stark had somehow acquired a fifth child in the orbit of his lab, and he did not examine this development closely, because examining it would lead somewhere he wasn't ready to go. That night, after dinner, after Zara and Marcus had gone home, after the debrief about the day that had somehow lasted an hour and covered everything from the Fenner-Matthews-Olsen complex to the specific strategic error Marcus had made in his fourth game with Ron, Tony sat at his workbench alone and ran the day through his head. One internet outage, one productive academic disagreement, one chess team, one groundskeeper, one new friend who already understood folded resonance geometry. He thought about what he'd said to Dr. Osai. They're going to surprise people. He opened the Jarvis resident file, looked at the 4 notes, looked at what he'd written at the bottom, they're fine, he thought about it. Added 3 words, they're more than fine, closed the file. Went back to the eviction model, which was slowly, carefully, molecule by molecule, becoming something he thought might actually work. Outside, Manhattan blazed. Inside, on the floor above, 4 kids slept in rooms designed for them. Tony worked until 3 a.m., which was normal. The difference was that, when he finally stopped and looked up at the dark lab and the bright city beyond the glass, it didn't feel like the same kind of alone as before. He didn't examine that either. Some discoveries you let come to you.